The pages turn themselves tonight. I swear by the weight of centuries that this ancient tome chooses which secrets to reveal. And tonight it bleeds ink over a tale the world dares call a children's story. Children's story, as if genocide could ever be suitable bedtime reading. Here, where the parchment still weeps with forgotten tears, I find the name that destroyed an entire people, Rumpelstiltskin. 3 syllables that the brothers Grimm wrapped in fairy dust and magical spinning wheels, when the truth is written in blood that never fully dried. This book has carried me through 8 centuries of lies disguised as legends. I have seen empires rise and fall, watched as atrocities transform into entertainment, witnessed the alchemy that turns screams into lullabies. But few tales sicken me as much as this one, because when children laugh at the funny little man who stamped his foot so hard he split in 2, they're celebrating the moment an entire race was erased from existence. You think you know this story? You know nothing? Let me tell you what really happened when Europe decided that some people were worth less than the gold they could produce, once upon a time. How I despise those words. It's the way they sanitize horror into harmless fantasy. There was indeed a miller's daughter, but she wasn't spinning straw into gold through magic. She was witnessing the systematic exploitation of a people whose only crime was possessing knowledge that others coveted. The tale begins, as all sanitized horrors do, with a lie. A poor miller, desperate to impress King Henry. Yes, this story has a real king. Though the sanitized versions rarely name him, boasted that his daughter could spin straw into gold. The king, ever hungry for wealth to fund his endless wars against the Welsh and Scottish, demanded proof. He dragged the girl to his castle and locked her in a tower room filled with straw, threatening death if she couldn't produce gold by morning. The girl wept, knowing the task was impossible. Straw is straw, gold is gold. And lies. Lies have a way of demanding payment and blood. But as midnight approached, the door opened, and in stepped a figure that would haunt European nightmares for centuries to come. He was small, perhaps 4 feet tall, with the gnarled hands of someone who had worked metal since childhood. His back was bent from years of labor in confined spaces. His eyes held the accumulated wisdom of generations, but also the weariness of a man who had watched his entire world burn. He wasn't magical. He was dying. It's one of the last survivors of communities that had been hunted, captured, and enslaved for their mastery of metallurgy and alchemy. These weren't fairy tale creatures. They were real people, members of communities that Europeans called the little people. Not because they were mythical, because systematic malnutrition and generations of hiding had stunted their growth. Over 1,000 years, they had lived in the deep forests of Central Europe, preserving knowledge that predated Roman civilization. The book falls open to a page marked with what looks suspiciously like dried blood. This page shows me their faces. Generations of master metalworkers who could transform worthless ore into gold through techniques that would not be discovered by European science for another 500 years. They understood that their craft wasn't just mechanical, it was spiritual, bound to their communities through ritual, song, and sacred tradition. For centuries they had survived by being useful, but never indispensable. They would appear at royal courts during desperate times, complete seemingly impossible tasks, and vanish back to their forests before anyone could steal their secrets. But by the 12th century, European nobility had grown tired of this arrangement. They didn't want to trade with these master craftsmen anymore. They wanted to own them, to break them, to extract every secret from their minds, and then eliminate the competition forever. What followed was one of the most systematic and thorough genocides in medieval European history. The hunting of the forest communities began during the reign of Henry II of England, though it quickly spread across the Holy Roman Empire and into France. Medieval chronicles, when you know how to read between the lines, are filled with accounts of these systematic hunts, royal warrants for expeditions into wild territories to capture specialized craftsmen, church records documenting the forced baptism and civilizing of forest dwellers and cave people, tax rolls listing skilled metalworkers held under what were essentially slavery contracts by various nobles. The process was always the same. Military expeditions would surround known settlement areas using hunting dogs and fire to flush out the inhabitants. Those who resisted were killed immediately. The elderly and infirm were left to die. Children and adults of working age were captured and transported in chains to royal workshops and castle forges. But the nobles quickly discovered that simply owning these craftsmen wasn't enough. Their knowledge was cultural, passed down through generations of family tradition and community bonds. A master metalworker separated from his people was like a musician forced to play without knowing the song. This is where the systematic destruction began. To extract their secrets, the captors had to break their culture. Families were torn apart, children were stolen, sacred traditions were forbidden. The demand was unjust for labor. It was for the complete surrender of everything that made these people who they were. The spinning straw into gold in the fairy tale represents this forced extraction of knowledge. Picture it. A brilliant metallurgist, captured and enslaved, forced to demonstrate processes that his people had perfected over millennia.
Right.
While his captors watched and took notes like vultures picking at a corpse. The straw represents the raw materials that seemed worthless to European eyes, but could be transformed into precious metals through techniques the captors could understand. The 3 nights of spinning in the fairy tale correspond to the 3-stage process that medieval records describe for extracting complete knowledge from captured craftsmen. First, they would be forced to demonstrate their basic techniques. This earned them temporary reprieve and better treatment, represented by the necklace in the story. They would be required to reveal more advanced processes. The ring represents the additional privileges granted for this deeper knowledge. But the 3rd stage was the most crucial and most devastating. On the 3rd night, when the craftsman in the fairy tale demands the queen's firstborn child, he's not making a supernatural bargain. He's describing the real price that European nobles demanded for allowing these master craftsmen to continue existing. The complete surrender of their future generations. The nobles had realized that, to truly own this knowledge, they had to ensure that it would never again exist independently of their control. This meant separating children from their families permanently, forbidding the use of their traditional languages, and eliminating their cultural practices. The systematic removal of children from these communities wasn't just about acquiring future workers. It was about ensuring that the cultural matrix that preserved and transmitted metallurgical knowledge would be destroyed forever. Historical records from the period document this process with chilling precision. Chronicles describe how captured children were distributed among different noble households to prevent them from maintaining contact with each other. Church records detail forced conversion ceremonies where these children were required to renounce not just their religious practices, but their very names and identities. The children were given new names chosen by their captors, usually names that reflected their intended function rather than their heritage. Many were simply referred to by their specialization: gold worker, ironsmith, alchemist. Others received names that were deliberately degrading, designed to constantly remind them of their subordinate status. This is where the true horror of the name Rumpelstiltskin becomes clear. Linguistic analysis reveals that it's a compound word derived from Middle High German, Rumpel meaning wrinkle or fold, and Stiltskin meaning little post or stake. But these weren't just random descriptive terms. In the mining and metalworking communities of medieval Germany, Stiltskin referred specifically to the wooden stakes used to mark mining claims and property boundaries. The compound Rumpelstiltskin was a derogatory term used by mine overseers and metalwork supervisors to refer to their shortest workers, the ones who could fit into the narrowest shafts and most dangerous working spaces. But it carried additional connotations that made it particularly cruel. It reduced human beings to the level of property markers, suggesting that they existed only to stake claims for their owners. More devastating still, the term was used specifically for workers who had been captured from the forest communities. It wasn't just a description of their physical appearance or their function. It was a constant reminder that they were property. Stakes driven into the ground to mark their owners' claims to knowledge and skill that had once belonged to free people. When the queen in the fairy tale discovers the craftsman's name, she's not revealing magical knowledge. She's using the very slur that strips him of his humanity and reduces him to a tool of his oppressors. The word that turns a master craftsman, a keeper of ancient wisdom, into a property marker to be used and discarded. His rage when she speaks it is on supernatural fury. It's the documented reaction of someone whose entire identity has been stolen and weaponized against them. Medieval records describe similar reactions from captured craftsmen when they were addressed by the derogatory terms their captors assigned them. Psychological devastation of having your name, the most fundamental aspect of your identity, placed with a slur that denies your humanity, was often more destructive than physical torture. The craftsman's violent reaction, stamping so hard he disappears into the earth, represents the final choice that many of these enslaved masters made, when they realized that their knowledge had been fully extracted and their lives were no longer valuable to their captors. Rather than continue existing as living tools, many chose suicide, often in ways that would destroy evidence of the techniques they had been forced to reveal. Medieval records describe instances of captured metalworkers deliberately destroying their workshops, contaminating metal stores, or setting fires that would eliminate the products of their forced labor. Others would refuse food until they died, would find ways to poison themselves using the very chemicals they had been forced to work with. The disappearance into the earth in the fairy tale likely refers to the common practice of these craftsmen, questing burial in specific ways that would symbolically return them to the mountain and forest communities they had been torn from. Even in death, they sought to rejoin their people and their ancestral lands. But the knowledge they had been forced to reveal lived on. The gold that funded European expansion, the weapons that conquered indigenous peoples worldwide, all incorporating techniques stolen from the people, whose descendants now exist only in fairy tales. By the 16th century, the independent forest communities were gone. Some individuals had been absorbed into the larger population through forced assimilation, their children given European names and raised to deny their heritage. Others had been worked to death in the mines and workshops of their captors, their techniques carefully documented before their deaths. Many had simply vanished, their fate unrecorded by the very people who had destroyed them. Archaeological evidence confirms this systematic erasure. Excavations reveal thriving communities until the 12th century, followed by sudden abandonment. Hidden workshops found, sealed, or destroyed. Burial sites showing evidence of malnutrition and violent death. Most chilling of all, the rapid advancement of European metallurgy during exactly this period. Techniques unknown for centuries suddenly appeared in royal workshops, just as the forest communities vanished forever. The transformation of this genocide into a children's story serves multiple purposes, all of them serving the interests of those who perpetrated the original crimes. It preserves some memory of these communities while completely obscuring the violence used to destroy them. It presents their exploitation as a fairy tale bargain rather than systematic oppression. Most insidiously, it teaches children that discovering someone's true nature, their essential identity, gives you the right to destroy them. This pattern of dehumanization and cultural appropriation didn't end with the medieval period. The same techniques, capturing marginalized peoples, extracting their knowledge through violence, eliminating their communities, and then transforming their destruction into entertainment, were used against Jewish communities during the pogroms, Roma populations throughout European history, and eventually against indigenous peoples in European colonies around the world. The Rumpelstiltskin story provides a template for how genocide gets transformed into moral instruction. The victim becomes a threatening figure whose destruction is presented as necessary and just. Their knowledge and culture are stripped away and claimed by their oppressors. Their very names are replaced with slurs that justify their elimination. And finally, their annihilation becomes a source of entertainment and moral guidance for the children of those who destroyed them. Modern analysis of European folklore reveals this pattern repeated throughout the continent's storytelling traditions. Tales of interactions with little people, forest dwellers, mountain folk, and other marginalized communities almost universally follow the same structure: initial contact, recognition of valuable knowledge or resources, conflict over access to those resources, and final victory by the normal human community. These stories served as both historical documentation and ongoing justification for the systematic elimination of minority communities. They preserved enough detail about the destroyed peoples to maintain some cultural memory, while framing that memory in ways that justified rather than condemned their destruction. The weight of this knowledge, some nights, as I turn these blood-stained pages, I wonder if forgetting might be kinder. But then, I see their faces in the faded illustrations. Hear their names whispered by the wind that turns these ancient leaves, and I remember why this book chose me as its guardian. Because someone must remember the real Rumpelstiltskin, not the magical creature who spun gold. but the brilliant metalworker whose people's only crime was possessing knowledge that others wanted to steal. Someone must speak their true names, not the slurs that destroyed them. Someone must ensure that when children hear this story, they understand they're not laughing at a funny little man who stamped too hard. They're hearing the death cry of an entire people, transformed into a lullaby. The book grows heavier in my hands as I read the true ending of this story. There was no happy ever after for the miller's daughter. Historical records suggest that the real young woman who witnessed these events spent the rest of her life haunted by what she had seen. She had been forced to watch as human beings were reduced to tools, had witnessed the systematic torture and destruction of ancient communities, had learned that the gold in her husband's treasury was literally stained with blood. The real ending is written here, in handwriting that grows shakier with each word, as if the scribe's hand trembled with the weight of what he was recording. The woman lived long enough to see the complete elimination of the forest communities, long enough to understand that she had been a witness to genocide. And in her final years, she told the true story to anyone who would listen, desperately trying to preserve some memory of the people whose destruction had made her a queen. But her words were transformed even as she spoke them. The scribes who recorded her testimony were employed by the same nobility that had perpetrated the crimes she described. They couldn't allow her account to stand as an accusation against their patrons, so they added magical elements, transformed the systematic murder of communities into supernatural bargains, and turned the victims into threatening figures whose destruction was justified and necessary. The ancient tome pulses beneath my palm like a beating heart. It carries within its pages the blood, tears, and final words of those who deserved so much better than to become cautionary tales about making deals with strangers. Tomorrow, it will choose another story to reveal, another truth that the world buried beneath fantasy and fear. But tonight we remember the real Rumpelstiltskin. Their names are written here, in ink that time cannot fade. Master craftsmen who could coax gold from stone through understanding passed down across millennia. Children who were stolen from their families and had their identities replaced with slurs. Elders who carried the accumulated wisdom of civilizations and died in chains rather than surrender the last of their people's secrets. As long as this book exists, as long as I draw breath to speak their truth, they will not be forgotten. The story ends, but the reckoning has only just begun.